So this afternoon, we're going to dive into a little bit more of the analysis that our team has put together, and then talk about how we've tried to integrate the analysis into the local master plans and the communities that we worked with, and then also as part of the zoning ordinance language. So actually, I'm going to turn this over to Guy, who's going to talk a little bit about the data that his team has put together when we go back to that Shoreline Recession piece that we talked about.
You may recall we said earlier that our memories get worse as the older we get. We don't remember the last high water mark and the effects it's had on the beach. And then that coupled with, on the exposed coastline, in Michigan at least, the average time that a shorefront property owner owns the property is a little over 7 years. So property is always changing hands very quickly. Which means new people are coming in that haven't experienced the shoreline most likely. So to try and rectify that, we're doing what we call the 80-year look. So we now have the technology to go back to 1938 and accurately map the shoreline down to the property owner detail. So you can have a conversation with the property owner and now show them graphically and pictorially how that individual property has changed over the last 80 years. And the plan is to keep updating that as time marches on. So you see here for New Buffalo Harbor, shows the 1938 shoreline in orange. The harbor at New Buffalo was I don't know, 76 added? Where's Matt? Something like that. Harbor was not there, shoreline was perfectly straight. This is the 2016 shoreline. You can see the accretion on the updrift side, a pretty significant amount, and on the downdrift side, a corresponding loss of properties. So we think this is going to be a valuable tool. Some days it's a public website. We keep fighting with our IT people, but the goal is that eventually this will be totally public. You can try it today. We'll give you the website for that. What you gonna do to me, buddy?
I'm sorry, I thought you were gonna move to that.
That's okay. Yeah, that was a good time.
Right. You're done.
Okay. Yeah, we rehearse this a lot. So let me back out first. Wrong way. Give you the big picture. So we started this about 2 years ago, and we have completed the entire Lake Michigan shoreline. Trust me, we have. It's always scary to go live. So, back to where I was. South Haven. Let me find a good spot here. Sorry for the messing around here. Should have never left. Just stayed right where I was. Oh, here's Palisades plant. That's probably a good place. So the little airplanes out here give you the oblique view, which is very helpful again for looking at the shoreline. And you can toggle on and off all these different layers of imagery. So we are looking at the shoreline and bluff line superimposed on the 2016 imagery. There is the 1938 imagery of what that section of shoreline looked like. Let's just zoom into one particular spot here. So you can toggle back and forth between the two and show yourself what that all looked like. You also can turn on and off a variety of other shorelines and sections of shoreline, and take a look at this section, for example, here, been extremely stable. This section here, if we go to the 1938 photographs, was still there in some respects. Here we have a pretty substantial difference in the 1938 shoreline versus the 2016 shoreline, and then here we have added the bluff line. And if we go on down the shoreline, let's just pick a random property, for example, say here, go right to the individual property owner level. We can see the edge, the top of the bluff, the bottom of the bluff, and the shoreline, and what that looked like in 1938. And clearly the 38 imagery is nowhere near as good as the more modern imagery. Yeah.
Well, on the cycle, where was 38 high and low water?
I don't know. 38, do we have that listed? Hang on here.
On the line work guy, there's the levels on the legend.
Yeah, thank you. 578, so about 2 feet lower than it is now. And that's a good point. Nearshore slopes are about 50 to 1. So for every foot of elevation change, you either gain or lose 50 feet of beach. If it's only water level change, then that's inundation and not erosion. But keep in mind, if that material is lost permanently, then it is erosion. So there's some finer points there to keep in mind. We go south of St. Joe here. Here's maybe a good example. Very dramatic changes from year to year in the shoreline. If we take a look at what that shoreline actually looks like. This is a section that you saw that Dick had brought up. This is the old shoreline on an old revetment structure that was in place. There's revetment on the shoreline. There is an old remnant groin field here. So there's been multiple attempts to try and stabilize this section of shoreline because there's obviously been a major investment in that shoreline. So one of the things that we have been experimenting with is the predicted, looking 30 years into the future, there's where we expect the bluff line to be. That's if the erosion rate continues at the same rate it has been for the past 30 years. No, right to. Kind of scooch along here. You can see there's several properties in pretty serious danger. So there's question about setbacks and how long should they be and those types of things. So 30 years is typical mortgage. That's one way of doing it. Do you know what the state is based on?
This state has a 30-year setback as well as a 60-year setback. And it depends on the size and type of structure that's proposed as to which setback applies.
And let me show you that shoreline here from the oblique view. And again, long history of trying to slow down that erosion along there. Very steep bluffs, walkways down to the water's edge. And again, it's going to be very interesting to see how this changes now with high water level once again. So as I said, we've done this now for all of Lake Michigan. We're trying to clean it up so it's a little smoother to operate. And then we are working our way down this year, Lake Huron. Hope to have all Lake Huron done by the end of this year. And then I don't know what we're going to do when we go to Lake St. Clair. And let me do that real quickly here. So here we are on Google Maps, Lake St. Clair, kind of looking in this area. If we begin to zoom in, there's this kind of white area here that looks like a sand spit. And if you zoom in on it, I mean, these folks are a foot, yeah. What do you do with that? Oh, sorry about that.
Around there last week, taking pictures, and some of those streets that you go a little bit north, Anchor Bay Drive, is actually completely flooded over. That it's like a little bit north of this.
I was shocked when I was just looking at this.
That one up there.
Yeah, and then this sand spit is, just follows right along, and that is just wall-to-wall houses. Oh. So we're working our way to Lake St. Clair, but not enthusiastically. And then if you're really brave, you could be out here on the island. So we'll keep you posted on it. We'll give you the website. You can play with it on your own. And it's a work in progress, so it's not as smooth as it could be, but you're welcome to poke around on it.
So part of the message here is through this grant funding we've been getting, working with the state, we've been collecting and building a lot of data and trying to make it available on websites in various forums so that you all have access to it and can use it. So part of the way to not have to hire engineering firms to do lots of detailed investigative study is Guy's shop has already done it for you, and we've posted it online, and hopefully the state will find some way to be able to keep updating that information. The other thing we've been doing is trying to figure out how can we develop planning methods that smaller coastal communities can use to do sufficiently rigorous analysis to justify good policy making and zoning, recognizing the limited capacity most of these communities have, and trying to find off-the-shelf ways that we can use so-called off-the-shelf data so that you don't have to go out and do a lot of original field data collection and basic GIS technology. And I've had, for my part, I've had a number of students working on this, and all of the analytical techniques we're using really don't require anything more than a basic introduction to GIS class. So I'm sure most of you, the consulting folks in here, if you have anybody on staff who does GIS, they're probably beyond what the base level of work you need to do to be able to do the kinds of analysis we're doing. So what I want to do is show you where we're headed. So the issues that we're dealing with for Great Lakes communities really speak again to two kinds of challenges on Great Lakes coast in particular. One is lake level fluctuations, which are unique to the Great Lakes compared to ocean coastal settings, and then the effect that climate change may be having on that. So I was commenting at lunch, 10 years ago, some climate scientists came out with a study saying, we think the Great Lakes might actually drop in water levels over time because of climate change, which was a terrible thing for them to be saying, because that's when folks like in St. Joe are looking at their beach thinking, oh, the lakes are going down, we can build. And what they didn't point out was, but they're going to continue to fluctuate over this period of time. So maybe over the long term, the standing water levels will decline a bit, but they're still going to have these pretty dramatic fluctuations. Now they're looking at their models saying, yeah, maybe they're actually going to go up, because while evaporation is going down during the winter, precipitation is increasing during the summer, maybe that's going to balance it out. So if you have folks in your community saying the lakes are going to go down, don't stomp on that right quick, because we don't know that for sure. And the very least, they're going to continue this fluctuation cycle. Nobody has suggested that that's going to change. And in fact, Guy tells me that could even maybe get worse because of climate change, the kind of fluctuations that we're seeing. Storminess and fluctuations are a big consideration. So I'm going to talk about planning for hazard areas, and then Harry is going to talk a bit more about vulnerability assessment for communities. So a little bit of history on scenario planning. So scenario planning, as best we can tell, was first developed by the Rand Corporation in the 50s for military planning. And the first citation I could find in the planning literature was the 1990s, suggesting that we start using it. It's really used, as best I can tell in the literature, mainly for transportation planning right now. The folks doing transportation planning are using scenario-based planning. We've not found much published work on using it for hazard mitigation or coastal settings, except that we are. We're now picking it up. Part of the confusion with scenario planning is people use the term scenario to mean different things. So some folks talk about, a scenario is just a future condition, or it's a normative scenario that we can use to how this is how the landscape may change over time. Do you like it or not like it? Or if you're doing modeling, so a lot of our analyses of the way climate change might affect us are not based on observed data. They're based on models that folks develop to predict what could happen. Well, that's subject to a lot of calculation error, just modeling assumptions or not. So let's come up with scenarios that kind of predict a low emission outcome and a high emission outcome and all the variation in between. So the term's getting used in different ways. So the critiques that we've made of that approach is that what seems to be happening sometimes is people talk about using scenarios, but then what they're really doing is the conventional predict and plan. We think this is where we're headed, and so this is what you should do. Or they're developing, I read one transportation scenario-based planning article, and I'm a fairly educated, intelligent guy, and I couldn't make heads or tails out of it. Well, it's a transportation planning study, so you have to have really advanced transportation management skills to understand what they're doing. Well, how helpful is that for a small community of 5,000 people who are trying to figure out what to do and don't have the kind of technical chops to deal with that? And then it can be really demanding in terms of analysis. So we've really tried to develop a method to deal with that. So there are, I think, two fundamental aspects to scenarios. The first thing to know is scenarios are really good for dealing with uncertainty because you're not making predictions about where we're headed. You're basically laying out a range of possible futures and suggesting we could end up in any of these places depending on a whole lot of uncertain things we can't readily predict. So there are elements at play that are beyond a community's control. Where are the lakes going to be 10 years from now? How stormy is it going to get? We don't really know. We have some bands of possibilities that tell us the outer range, but we can't tell for sure. And then the other piece of a scenario is, well, what are the things you can control? What are the policy choices you can make on where development's going to happen or not, or how it's going to be structured? So our whole idea for scenario-based planning is to do what we're calling decision-centered scenario planning. So we just had a paper accepted. It's going to come out this winter, I think, in the Journal of the American Planning Association that lays all of this out. So that'll give a lot of good detail about a lot of what we've been presenting today will be in that paper. And then the other thing you should know is we have a website, resilientgreatlakescoast.org, where we've been laying out all of the methods we've been developing that I'm going to show you today. And so we're hoping, and it's really designed for folks like you, professional planners. So there's not a whole lot of background stuff, generic stuff. It's really more the methods. How do you do the scenario-based planning that I'm going to show you today? So we're hoping you can pick it up and use it as a source information to do the kinds of analyses we're talking about. So the idea with, and we're calling it simple, because you'll see analytically it's very easy to construct, and we're really relying on data that you shouldn't have much difficulty getting a hold of. You don't have to go out and do original field work to do it. So that's the simple piece. The decision-centered piece is we're laying out explicitly different climate futures, and I'll talk more about this in a second, and setting them against different management options communities can adopt. And when you set a climate future against a management option, you have a scenario. And now you can start analyzing what could happen under this scenario. None of these are for sure predictions. All of them are realistic possibilities. Does that make sense? So that's the concept of the scenario that we're trying to develop. So again, it's all about navigating uncertainty. We're using basically readily available data to make some of the assumptions. So we know what the average low water levels are over time. We know where the all-time highs have been. We know where the all-time lows have been. That gives us a good range of scenarios to map out, or climate futures to map out. And I'll suggest to you, here's the lawyer in me talking again, the courts do not expect that local governments have a perfect crystal ball that they can use to predict exactly what's going to happen when and where. What they look for is some reasonable effort on the government's part to come up with reasonable analyses, to adopt reasonable regulations. And I'm pretty confident that the methods we're laying out, if used by a community, are going to be pretty robust. They're going to pretty well demonstrate to a court, yep, they're taking reasonable steps, given what we have the capacity to do, to adopt reasonable regulation. So I don't think you need, again, I'll say this again, you don't need to, you can hire engineering firms to do really detailed studies if you think that's necessary, but I don't think you need to. I think we've got enough good data to make some good decisions. Okay, so the climate futures. We worked with Ludington first, and then Pure Marquette Township and Hamlin Township to start out this process, and then we worked a bit with St. Joe, and then we worked really closely with the Grand Havens, the city and the township, to fully flesh this out. And what we heard from them were a couple things. One, don't give us more than 3 climate futures. Three seems to be a magic number, right? More than 3, then it starts to get too confusing. And use labels that are easy to grasp. So the labels we came up with are a lucky future, an expected future, and a perfect storm future. You don't need to use these labels with your communities, but I think they resonate and they kind of make sense. On a Great Lakes shoreline, what we're doing is combining storminess and water levels. So for a lucky future, we're looking at what conditions might be when the lakes are close to their all-time low, and we're looking at the FEMA mapped 50-year storm, which is kind of pulling that in and suggesting the 50-year storm is something you're likely to experience in a 20-year period, which we're taking to be the typical planning period. And the expected future is combining Great Lakes water levels where they would be close to their long-term average. And here's the analytical trick. We're saying because of climate change, what used to be the 1% storm is now more like the 2% storm. What used to be the 100-year storm is more like the 50-year storm. So here's a little bit, you all should know this. So where do we get that terminology? You kind of asked about it earlier. So the 100-year storm event is a little bit confusing. The idea is the 100-year storm is a storm event you would expect to happen once every 100 years. The problem with that conceptualization is if you have a 100-year storm event, everybody thinks, great, we're good for another 99 years, which is not true. You can have 500-year storms happen in 5 years. In fact, you can have 500-year storm events happen in 1 year. FEMA's trying to get away from the 100-year storm event labeling and calling the percentage storm. So the 1% storm, the 100-year storm, is the storm where you have a 1% chance of that happening in any given year. Does that make sense? What used to be the 50-year storm, they're trying to call the 2% storm. This is the storm that you might, there's a 2% chance of that happening any given year. what used to be the 500-year storm is the 0.2% storm. The problem is, Jeff Andreessen, I heard him say in a conference a couple months ago, Houghton last summer experienced 2 or 3 500-year storms over the course of about 3 months. Climate change is pulling forward the intensity and frequency of these storm events. It takes FEMA forever to go out and map new firms based on changing hydrologic conditions and land use cover. So don't expect them to be updating their 500-year storm floodplains any given year. But maybe you don't need to, because maybe what we can do analytically is say, well, let's consider the 1% storm is now being the storm of planning a 20-year storm event that we should be really thinking about. We're very likely to experience that in the next 20 years. And what we used to think of as the 500-year storm event maybe is going to be more like the 100-year storm event, what we used to think of as the 100-year storm event. So now we're expanding the area that we think are in high hazard areas, but we're doing it by just expanding those assumptions rather than going out and remapping FEMA maps. Does that make sense analytically? And I think that's credible because we are seeing such an increase in the frequency intensity of storms. It's not unreasonable to say we're pulling forward in time what used to be the 500-year storm event, given changing patterns. So again, we're getting all of this from published FEMA firms. And there is right now a FEMA study going on. I don't know where it's going to lead, where they're attempting to map VE zones. So let me explain that. Anybody know what that is, a VE zone? Anybody been to North Carolina and looked at the houses on the shore? What's unique about them, do you know? They're all way up on stilts. On all of the ocean coasts, FEMA has mapped, in addition to the floodplain maps, what are called VE zones, high velocity energy zones, wave action zones. So those are the zones close to the shoreline that are subject to high energy wave action. And in those zones, if you're in that zone, not only do you have to elevate your house above base flood elevation, you have to elevate it above the zone of high energy wave action. And so that means putting houses up on stilts. FEMA has never mapped VE zones in the Great Lakes, and I haven't been able to find out why. I've had some people tell me they tried to about 20, 30 years ago, and the political pushback was so fierce that they dropped it. I suspect they're not doing it because of all of the complexity that Guy pointed out with how do you do this. I think it's just analytically really difficult to figure out where a VE zone is when the lakes are low for 10 years and then they're high for 10 years. So how do you do that? Well, having said that, they're doing a coastal inundation study right now where they're attempting to map VE zones. They've issued proposed VE zones for a lot of the Lake Michigan shoreline, but nothing formal. They haven't adopted any of them yet. If they do, that could trip new requirements that we'll have to fold into this discussion, because then FEMA may be telling property owners you got to elevate your homes on stilts. But it also represents another potential data source communities can be using on their own. The other thing, on the resilient Great Lakes coast shoreline, you'll find a table where we don't have VE zones mapped. What we have done is taken the FEMA floodplain maps, and then Guy and his team calculated reasonable wave run-up estimates, so storm run-up estimates. So another bit of elevation where you might expect water to reach when there's a high water level and the storms are fierce. So it's all about, by the way, what we're heading toward is mapping the land area that's subject to flooding or high energy waves. So the way you get there is to figure out what's the elevation that the water could reach. So if you take a FEMA floodplain map, which gives you an elevation during storminess, and then you add on Guy's wave run-up, now you've got a pretty good guesstimate of where wave energy could reach during a high intensity storm. Does that make sense? So we have on that website a map that shows our best guess estimates of wave run-up numbers. So that's a credible data source to use to start generating those maps that you have access to. So here's some mapping that we did showing that. So this is Grand Haven. This is including both the water, the river itself, but also land area that's adjacent to the water that could be flooded in a lucky future, which means today. It means yesterday, really, because the lakes are already coming up. And you'll notice right away, there are already some structures. The black areas are structures that are in flood zones, which shouldn't be there. I don't know. We never went back and asked Grand Haven, what did you do? How did that happen? Here's the area that could be underwater during an expected future. So again, this is average water levels, and now what used to be the 100-year storm reconceptualized more as the 1% storm in a 20-year period. So there's a lot more at risk. And a lot of this is going to be riverine flooding. And then here's the perfect storm. Now we've got structures that are really at risk of getting washed into the lake during a storm event. So the other thing that I've learned from Guy in the last few sessions we've given, not only there is actually some correlation to the strength of wave action and water levels. The higher the lakes are, the more you can expect to have more fierce storm events. So it's not unreasonable to think that actually could credibly happen anytime soon, because we're getting pretty close to high water level. So if the right storm hits next week on Lake Michigan, we could see it happen. The problem is, who knows if the right storm is going to hit? And if it does, how much of the lake might it hit? It could hit up here, and this part of the lake won't get hit at all, right? Storms are that focused enough. So that's where this uncertainty comes in. We're playing with a lot of uncertainty here. Everybody with me so far? So the first step in the scenario-based planning is to get the numbers, go to the website, look at the methods we've used to do the mapping, and Paul's going to talk a little bit more about how to do this kind of mapping, and map your high hazard zones. The next step is to think about what are the management options that a community might contemplate. And for simplicity, again, we picked out 3, and it's really an array of options. The one is kind of the baseline, what's currently here now. The second option is a build-out analysis of what you could end up having if you build out under your current zoning scheme without modifying it. And the third is, what if you adopted some basic best management practices? And that would be, for what we modeled was setbacks. 50-foot setbacks from high water levels and wetlands. And when we've worked with communities, we've pretty regularly heard, oh, we're pretty well built out, especially the cities. We're pretty well built out, that we're not going to see much more development. No, actually, there's probably a whole lot more room for development in your community than what you think, because you're used to what it is now. You're not thinking through what have you zoned to allow. And there could be quite a bit more there. And we're getting the data for this from the master plans and the zoning codes that you have in place, and the spatial, the partial structure data that communities have, and the tax data that communities have. And then we used Community Viz. Have you heard of that? It's an extension. I, by the way, know nothing about GIS except that it generates really nice maps. I have students who do that for me. But I understand that Community Viz is just a standard ArcGIS extension, and it allows you to do build-out assessments. You plug in zoning code provisions, and then it kicks back, here's what you could see happen. It doesn't perfectly cite structures where they might happen, but it kind of randomly scatters them within zones where they could happen. And you have to build in some assumptions like how much land you set aside for rights of way and that kind of stuff. But you can vet with your local officials what are the assumptions we want to bake into this build out to make sure that it's reasonable and likely to happen. So here is what Grand Haven currently has in the way of developed structures. Here's the build out assessment we did under their current zoning without amendment. The red structures are non-residential, i.e. commercial structures. The yellow are single-family residential, and the black are other, I guess. And then here's the build out when we add the setbacks. So the message here is you're still allowing a lot of development in your community. You're not allowing it to take place in the highest risk areas. So part of the message to the community is you're not shutting down development. And we really tried to stress this to the local officials. We're not here to tell you you have to stop building in your community. We are here to tell you that maybe there are places where you want to not let development happen. So it may mean on an individual parcel, they may not get to build what they want to build or exactly where they build it, but hopefully they can find something to build somewhere so that you don't run into a regulatory taking problem. I'll talk more about that in a minute too. Does that make sense so far? So I'll tell you too, when we did these analyses, for the number of times we did it, we would put this up, and then it wouldn't be unusual for a planning commissioner to say, oh, that'll never happen. And then we would kind of step back and let them start talking. Well, yeah, someone's got this land, and that's that. And every time we did this, by the end of the discussion, yeah, that could happen. Wow, we have a lot more development that could happen than we thought we did. So here, once you map those areas into those structures, now you can start doing analysis to say, well, what are the implications of these different build-out patterns? So this is Grand Haven, I believe, yep. Already they've got 17 structures at risk under a current development and a lucky future, and that could go all the way up to 189 structures if the perfect storm hits. That's structures right now in place. And then we're finding this same pattern over and over again when we've done this. If they do build out under current zoning, they could see a substantial increase in development, especially if they build out and the perfect storm hits. If they build out with some setbacks, they're still going to have structures at risk, but they're not going to have nearly as many new structures at risk. So the other message we've been trying to give is you can't zone out or regulate or manage away risk completely. We live in the world, it's a risky place. You can't completely get rid of risk, but you can surely manage it and reduce it pretty substantially. You can identify where the worst places are to build and start adopting some rules and policies and regulations to try and minimize how much new development is going to be in risky places. The other kinds of things you can start mapping are where are the wetlands in your communities, how might they be affected. Wetlands in riverine flooding areas are a good thing. Hopefully through your regulations you're seeing more wetlands in those areas because they're great buffers for riverine systems, and they're a good use of land. Natural park systems that people can use when the lakes are low and the waters are low, but then become that absorption area when the lakes are high. That's a good thing. So maybe you want to increase impervious surfaces that way. And then we've also developed methods to do fiscal, which is what a lot of folks want to see. Okay, so for Grand Haven Township, a couple things to take from here. Uniformly, the numbers of properties and the SEV, standard equalized values of those properties, for the land areas within these high-risk areas compared to the rest of the community are really small. At worst, 3% of the SEV value under a perfect storm build-out scenario, only 3% of the community's property values are at risk. We often hear from local officials, we can't regulate this shorefront property, or that's a major source of tax revenue for us. Well, it probably isn't. It's probably a relatively small portion of your SEV value in the whole community. So we kind of hone in on these coastal areas and think, wow, that's really important, and forget there's a huge rest of the community out there that's been built out. Don't let community folks overstate the value of the tax revenues they might get off of these properties. It's really pretty small. Does that make sense? At the same time, when we also use HAZUS and other databases to show potential damage from flood events. Oh my God, $174 million in damage, potential damage if they build out. And that 3% of your property tax base could generate $174 million in damage if the right storm hits. If you dropped BMPs, you're still going to have potentially a lot of damage, but maybe half as much. And this is going to be the money that everybody pays for, that either gets picked up in federal disaster relief or state disaster relief funds, or the city has to pay for. These costs are including all of the kind of recovery and response costs that could come about from a storm. The problem here is, who knows if this is going to happen? It could happen tomorrow. It may not happen for 30 years in any given community. So what this whole method does, so this is where we tell communities, we're not going to stand here and tell you that you have to pick one of these as the predicted future. We're telling you this is the range of possibilities you're facing. You as a community need to decide where you're willing to start making these trade-offs. The other thing I'll point out is, even if you do BMPs, even some basic BMPs, you can still allow for substantial development in your community, but you can start substantially reducing risk and managing risk. So start thinking that way. Does that make sense so far? The other thing, so when I had this under review for JAPA, I got one of my reviewers was like, well, what's the difference between a 1% storm and a 2% storm, and are you accounting for that? And my pushback on that was, you don't really need to get that level of detail. What you're doing through this kind of analysis is getting people to recognize this is an issue that we need to deal with. There is some uncertainty about what exactly we do, but there are good reasons to do something. And no matter what we do in our modeling, there's going to be some inherent uncertainty. So don't hone in too much on the precise details. Don't lose the forest for studying too much the trees. Does that make sense? So in a way, it's almost too risky to try and be too fine-tuned with your analysis, because that suggests a level of certainty that you don't have. But you can do analysis that shows this is a good thing to be thinking about and maybe a good direction to be heading in terms of adopting policies. Does that make sense? OK. So again, we've posted this. This is the Resilient Great Lakes Coast website. And one of the links you'll find there is the planning methods. And within that website, then each of these topics we've laid out in as much as we could, a kind of step-by-step. Here's how you can do this analysis and pull it together. And our goal is to keep updating this as we keep continuing to do our work, add more examples, and then maybe at some point hand it off to Matt Warner to maintain at the state.
So this is Paul Riess, who's our GIS technician at our shop, and I'm kind of like Dick. I know how GIS works, but I can't actually do it. So I brought the real deal here to kind of walk through how we actually make those scenario maps. Put it up to my mouth. To make those scenario maps, so we're just going to kind of walk step by step through that, and then we're going to talk about kind of vulnerability assessments as well.
Okay, I'm here to go through a couple pieces. One, to talk about how to develop some of these data sets. And the first, I've actually went to the website and downloaded this and was going through the different portions of it, trying to figure out partly what I needed to say here today, but also to figure out how to determine these different flood risk zones along the coast of Lake Michigan. This part of the talk is not going to focus too much on downtown areas or FEMA data. So the first thing you do with any GIS is actually trying to find data. It's not always easy to do. It's pretty good in the US, but looking for that kind of data, you need software to run this stuff. We're going to talk about some tools within the GIS and some of the methodology. So in this particular exercise, we need three different things. We need elevation data, either DEM, and that's what this manual asks us to do, but there's LiDAR available as well. We need a project boundary of some sort to do some clipping operations. We'll get into that. And a shoreline to know where to start this process. So one of the free sources is the Geospatial Data Gateway source. That has a lot of different stuff in there. Some of the free orthophotography can be found there as well. The manual says to go to the National Map Viewer. And so you go there, and up in the top left is the data download. Click that button, and you get this interface. It's a little bit hard to see, but once you are zoomed into the area that you're studying, in this case Manistee County, I just kind of randomly picked that, you outline your shore area, and then on the left side you go ahead and put a check mark on the elevation products. And I've zoomed into that, and that box will expand. It allows you to choose different layers from that. So we wanted to use the 1/3 arc-second DEM, which when you download it and start using it, it's roughly a 10 by 10 meter pixel resolution. And the manual, again, asks you to download an arc grid, although you could do things with the IMG. I've used that before, but I've not used grid float. So once you've chosen that, you get this box here in the top left showing you the thumbnail of what you're going to get and some other little statistics, and I think I've zoomed in on that. So there's a download link to the right of that, and when you do download it, you're going to get a zip file, I believe, and then when you unzip it, you'll get these folders, which mean pretty much nothing without the software to look at that and read through that. So the software we've used is ArcGIS, but in order to do this analysis, you're going to need Spatial Analyst, which is an add-on to ArcMap. As soon as you get that going, you click the Add Data button. Are you all GIS users here? Great. So some of this is just very simple stuff if you've used it before. So just point to the grid that you're going to be using, bring it up on screen. You can learn a lot about this kind of information, these DEMs, but I'll probably diverge a little bit here in a bit. I've added on the county lines here just so you see, and we're going to be working here in the Manistee area just a little bit. Some things you're going to need to do. First, you're going to need to take that raster data set, which is in floating point, and change it to integer. Excuse me. The next thing you're going to do is clip that raster to that project boundary, so the Manistee County boundary. And then you're going to convert the raster layer over into vector. And so while my machine was processing, I thought, well, I'm going to just do this little side commercial on DEM stuff and just kind of look at this a little bit. You can start to see different things. There's white areas, there's dark areas, and in your legend it tells you that the dark areas are your low areas and the whites are the higher ones, so you know where there's more hilly areas in the county. The big stretch right here at the bottom, if I can get there, is the Manistee River system. Zoom in on Portage Lake, which is just north and east of the city of Manistee, is the little village of Onekama is in the northeastern corner. There is a little lake connection to Lake Michigan over on the west side. And there's that little connection to the lake in very flat, probably flood-prone areas right here. Going back to that DM I didn't point out, but to the west of Portage Lake, there are some of these rounded areas, horseshoe-like shaped things, which are dune kind of things. And also there's something on this that caught my eye. If you've used DMs before, you can sometimes see it. There's some linear features in here. And at first you think, well, why are there any linear features? And when you start looking a little more, you find out that it's actually capturing some of the road beds through the community. So this is our DEM. The other thing is over between Portage Lake, and I'm not sure what that other lake is, there's a little white area right in here that would demarcate watershed boundaries. So you can use DEMs to do watershed boundaries, you can do viewshed analyses, all kinds of different things with DEMs. My process finished, and now I've got a polygon layer. And what we want to do now is clip that to a shoreline. So we've got a shoreline data line file. We're going to clip it to the project boundary as well because it keeps going up the shore and south of the shore. We want to buffer that line by 1,000 feet and then use that to represent our coastal zone area for that community. So this is the buffer tool. For those of you who might not know, a linear feature, a line feature is digitized from somewhere to somewhere else, and that indicates the direction of travel if it's a road. Well, in this particular case, if you're going to do a buffer and you want to do 1,000 feet on one side of the line or the other, you're going to know which side you're working with, the right side or the left side. If you buffer the wrong side, you buffered into Lake Michigan, which won't help you much. So you need to determine that first, but once you do that, you plug things in here. You plug in your linear unit, which is 1,000 feet, and to the right side in this particular case. So here's our line file, and then when we buffer it, you get this 1,000-foot buffer. And then we did the overlay to pull out the buffered area with the DEM turned over into a polygon file. And I just showed you a zoomed in version of that over on the right-hand side. So each one of those polygons are a specific elevation that we want to explore a little further. Dick, I think, talked about this just a bit, but go on to this website here for different lake elevations. We want to find the long-term average. We want to find the high and the low. And in the top left is a button that says change it 2 feet, so we'll do that. Over here on the top right, we want to get rid of Lake Superior, Lakes Huron, and Ontario. So all we're left with is just a graph of Lake Michigan. And again, over on the right-hand side, we check a couple boxes to do the long-term average line, the high, and the low. And depending on what version you have, this particular thing is a flash player, so you can hover on a line and get those elevations, which are these right here. Then the next thing you need to do is go to the map that Dick referenced, which is right here. And I zoomed into the Mackinac-Ludington area, and it says it's an 8.4 total surge to the lake. So now we have some added numbers. We've got the the elevations from the previous slide, the total storm surge, and we've got our flooding forecast 3 elevation numbers. Going back to the GIS, then we have to add some fields into our table at the top, and we've got an elevation feet that we populate by doing the conversion from metric into feet. And I've also included 3 fields there for the lucky, expected, and total storm. And what we're going to do then is anywhere where the elevation is 583.8, I think the number was, we're going to put in that column for lucky just a letter Y. Just say, yep, this one is the lucky. Do the same for expected and the perfect storm. And do some extra calculations. Here's the selecting by attribute box in order to do some of those things. And I'm kind of rushing this through. But now we've got a couple lines. I don't have cool little airplanes like Guy showed here, but I've got the U.S. Army Corps locations for their photography, their obliques. And I was just kind of panning up from Manistee, and I saw this weird kind of bulge into the total storm surge. I thought, well, what's that? So I clicked on one of these images, and it was this road end. Again, it was just completely random. I wasn't really even looking for anything particular, but then that house there on the left caught my attention. I thought, wonder what's going to happen with that when we overlay some stuff. So I've turned on the photography. I've added building footprints to that, and right in that notch, it sits that house. So the next slide, I've made that total storm, now I lost my train of thought, but I've made it transparent so you can see that it is damaging that home in that particular image at the top and the roadway. So a couple things you could do is lay on SEV, like Dick said. Another possibility is just to put on your road line segments and see what areas are going to be inundated to know how much cost there would be to replace some of those road segments if they were to wash out.
Okay, a couple? Okay, good. All right. Again, all these slides will be made available, and as Paul and Dick mentioned, it's actually on the website as well, that process. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the vulnerability assessment as part of the analysis that we've done for a lot of communities. So we've talked about flooding and inundation, but also want to talk about the vulnerability of the population itself. This time we're going to focus on heat. So heat is actually one of the most dangerous climate change conditions that we have in the state. More people are impacted by excessive heat than any other issue that we're having right now in the state of Michigan. So we are looking at a vulnerability assessment for a population by heat by looking at exposure and then sensitivity of that community. Here we go. So one of the first things that we did was we start to work with other folks at U of M and people around the state at the Michigan Department of Health to talk about what are the vulnerable populations within the community, who is most impacted by climate change, and especially when we talk about excessive heat. And we've really come up with 5 different populations within the community. I'll go back to that in a second. The percentage of people 65 years of age and older, households with people living alone, non-white population, percent of the households living below the poverty threshold, people 25 and older with less than a high school education, relative sensitivity of people to extreme, and that's what we get is this relatively sensitive population to these extreme heat events. So we're looking at the sensitivity of the population itself versus the exposure, which is essentially the land use or the community that we're in. We call it the biophysical hazard of the community itself. And I'm going to have Paul walk us through these maps. But essentially, we take those different sensitivities and we combine them to come up with an overall sensitivity of the community that we then overlay with some of these physical conditions.
In this particular section of my talk, we're using just mostly census data. Census block for the first 3 maps is 65 and older, the people living alone, and the non-white population, which is the census smallest geographic areas for those particular census variables. The last two there are the living in poverty and less than high school. Those are coming from the census block group data sets. In this particular map, I'm going to go through all the maps that are generated first, just so you get a lay of the land, and I'm going to focus in on just how we put together the population over 65 and older, and won't really discuss the other four because it's really the same methodology, you just have to have the right variables. So in this case, it's 65 and older. It shows you the distribution based on percentages within those blocks. And here's another view of, this is in the city of Monroe, with households with people living alone, again broken out into various percent ranges. Here's the non-white or the minority populations within the community, living in poverty, and the less than high school education if you're 25 years and older. So those maps make up the sensitivity, and there is a total sensitivity map that shows right now here on the screen, which kind of adds all these things together. Then we move on to the heat exposure part of the analysis, and there are two components here which don't come from the census but will plug into the census here at the end. It's the percent impervious surfaces and the percent tree canopy, and those two added together will be the relative environmental exposure. And here's a map of that with this per census block. And this is the impervious surface and the tree canopy. And then the total exposure are those two individual items added together. And then we go into and adding the sensitivity maps, which were those 5 census things with the last 2 exposure to give you the full vulnerability for your community. Guess the same one in there twice. Here's that same list. So we're going to show you just the very first one, how to map that. 2 through 5 are kind of done the same way. 6 is an addition of those. Then we jump to exposure, explain that just a bit, and then we'll arrive at the final map. So when you start off with the GIS, you pretty much start with nothing, except in this case, I didn't get rid of my title. But there's the map. I have blocks showing on that map. Also put on there are the road network, lakes, different things. And we're trying to shoot for the map on the right. Okay? So I've opened up our attribute table for this block area for this particular township. And this, again, is Onekama Township, just where we were looking earlier. And in our attribute table in the far right are 2 columns. The over 64, which shows you the number of people within a block that are that age or older. But it's that very last column, which is the percent over 64 that we want to map in this particular thing. So we bring up the layer properties, go in the symbology tab, go to graduated colors, and find the particular field that we want. And in there in the center is a percent over 64 that we want to tag into. The default in this case is a natural breaks, which is what we do want to run here. But the one thing we need to do, and that is get into the classify on the right there to eliminate zeros in this process. We don't want to show any of these, bring in the statistics for the 0 populations for a given block. So once we have the things ranked in the proper way, in this case, the ones in the dark color, there's more of those folk in a given block. We then, so we're doing the mapping as well, the legend, so we put in a percent symbol there, but we also put this number 5, which is our scoring. That has a higher score because there's more people in that particular block. So it's just a 5 through 1 score. And this is our map, but then we open up our attribute table again, and this time we need to add in that score value because we said we're going to add these scores together. So we've added a field in there. It's a single digit, it's a numeric field. And we will highlight all those records over there that fall into the 4% to 12.5. So we'll just grab those and populate that with a number 1. Do that all the way through our attribute table. You do that again for those living alone. So you're seeing here now the scores for the table here. The first column is at 65 that we just described, but you do the same exact thing for the living alone, the non-white, the poverty, and the high school. And once you have all those scores done, then you can get yourself the sensitive total by just adding each row up. Put that up on the screen and re-rank that. So then once you have them up there like that, you give that rescore, populate that rescore field with that number to use later on. We move on to the heat exposure. Now this is a little bit trickier to do. Most communities don't have an impervious layer. Some do. Probably don't have tree canopy. So one of the things you could do, and we did do that in some of our smaller communities, was actually digitize both of those, tree canopy and the impervious. And then we'll try to describe a different automated process that can work over larger areas, but not too large. This, I think, was an image from St. Joseph that Dick mentioned earlier. So here we have just natural color photo, ortho photo from the community. And in this case, we did not do hand digitizing, but in Ludington, I think we did, because we had a couple students that helped us with that. So you would just zoom around here, zoom close enough, and just start drawing around the different objects. Well, sometimes it's a little difficult with natural color to see certain things. So we've had available to us the near infrared. And you can see that the tree canopy really pops out at you. And you can use that, kind of go back and forth to try to determine your lines that way, your polygons. Well, in St. Joe, we tried a different method that takes a color infrared image and converts it through a process. It's called NDVI. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's a normalized difference vegetation index. And when you run through that process, you wind up with this image. It is obviously they're all images, so it's raster based. But now instead of there being millions of colors to the palette, there's only 254. So it's a 1 through 254. So any of the, just like our elevation DEM, the lighter areas are the vegetation, and the darker ones are your impervious. And so you can select based on those values, and in this particular case, I think it was around 145 or 150 to 255, pulled out or highlighted all the bright white areas. It works sometimes, doesn't always work perfectly, because when you go through the process of doing that, then you do a dissolve command and you just do some basic edits. You see up here in the top, let's see if I can get here, can't even see the dot, there it is. This little piece, if I go back, you'll see there's nothing there. There's no tree canopy. Healthy grass will sometimes give the same reflectance as a tree, so you have to go through and kind of eliminate. Golf courses are a big one too, but at least this way, it saved hours and hours of digitizing by doing this. Next step, we have to get this information, or the impervious, we're just going to describe this one, into the census blocks. So what I did then is overlaid, these are just the outlines of the blocks on top of the tree canopy. You run through a process called intersect, which takes these two layers and actually every edge that's in one gets cut into the other, and the attributes from both tables are put together into one table. So now any of those areas are, one thing I did forget to mention, in the block layer, there is a field that is a unique identifier. It's called a GeoID field, and that's a unique thing for the entire US. So every single block has one of these GeoID fields. So when you do all this merging and dissolving and intersecting, each tree canopy within a block has a GeoID code. And since they're all cut by those boundaries, you can then do some calculations on them. Now you can determine the total acreage of each of these tree canopy blobs within a block. You also know from the original census how many acres the block had. Do the math, right? And you can get percentage tree canopy for every single block that way. And then you just have to merge that data back into, use a join command, and you've got basically the tree canopy percent. And you map that just like we did some of those other maps as well. So in this case, we're doing percent. And in this instance, the areas with least tree canopy score the highest. Obviously, anybody who's been outside in the summer, especially today, it's a little cooler under a shade tree than outside of that. So we've scored them in that way. The impervious is just the opposite of this. So we've got them both scored here at the bottom again, and the total exposure column adds those two together, and then we get another rescore. It's pretty simple. It's kind of repetitive. But then that rescore is used in the very final assessment. We take the rescore 1 and the 2 together to get our vulnerability total, and that then is used to make this final map. So the areas in the dark are the ones that are probably need more kind of resources possibly for a community. And I think Harry will get into parts of that here in the next section.
Okay, does the whole process make sense? Essentially, we're trying to find the folks in our community that are most vulnerable to these excessive heat events, and then figure out by looking again at tree canopy and impervious surface, how does that environment contribute to their vulnerability? So once we have those maps, that's great that we have that, but can we start to overlay those maps on other things within the community that might impact how we might respond to some of those excessive heat events? So I won't show the overlay, but essentially we did a social services and community centers map. This is for the city of Monroe and Monroe Township and Frenchtown Township. When we talked to the community, we figured out these were the places where if there's an excessive heat event that the Red Cross actually makes as cooling centers. So it's your libraries, governmental buildings, universities, essentially public places of worship, anything that's got that kind of connotation to it becomes a cooling center. So we can overlay that vulnerability map on a map like this and find out how far people are away, our most vulnerable populations, how close are they to these cooling centers. And what we found is that there are some populations that were very far away. And so the city worked with other of these community centers to find new cooling centers for those populations. So there's different ways you can overlay these vulnerability maps on other social services and community services in your community. So that's one way to then, again, respond to the climate changes that we're seeing within Michigan to these vulnerable populations. So that's one reason why we'd like to do this for every one of our communities. So shifting gears into, okay, all the things that we've talked about today, from recession to flooding to the vulnerability, how do we actually then get it into our local master plans and zoning ordinances? That always seems the hard part, especially when we have a lot of technical issues that we're talking about and a lot of analysis. How do we do that? There's different ways to do it. When we originally started this project, we thought that master plan process was a great way to do that because, again, it goes back to those systems that I talked about at the beginning. Your master plan probably should talk about all the different systems in your community, and this is an opportunity to then figure out how climate change and some of the vulnerability pieces and the flooding pieces, the shoreline pieces that we've talked about fit into those sections. The master plan also by nature is a public process, right? So we have opportunity to do education workshops just like this as part of that master planning process. But you can implement resilient climate change actions within all kinds of different types of planning and zoning techniques and plans, whether it's a recreation plan, site plan review, capital improvement, watershed management. These are all things where you can actually have resilient thinking and resilient planning within those documents. Again, we like the master plan approach because it does look at not only the short-term future, but also has a kind of a long time horizon in terms of what we're looking at for the community. It incorporates the whole community, and as I mentioned before, the more that you can do at least some of the master planning process with neighboring communities, all the better. We're fortunate that we have grant money, so we can come to communities and say, you must work together, and that's what a lot of folks do. So for example, when we did Grand Haven, we did the city of Grand Haven and Grand Haven Township at the same time. They actually went through the same master planning process. And so they're actually working kind of together and implementing some of these resilient ideas that we're talking about. Obviously, the master plan is really a fact book of all the things that go on in your community. So all the maps and analysis that we've talked about earlier, we've included in the master plan under their map section. So they have that readily available. And those are all fact-based then goals and objectives because we have all those maps and that data in the plan. I talked about education and civic engagement being kind of a natural process of the master plan that allows you to do that with your community. And then you can really base on your goals and objectives in doing that. So I don't want to walk through every single page of the City of Grand Haven master plan, but I want to show you at least how we've incorporated that. So within the building in section 3, within thinking about our future, we actually have a chapter that's dedicated to coastal planning and climate trends, and then also defining vulnerability in the Grand Haven community. So we have whole chapters that are devoted to that within the master plan. Those can be very technical and pithy, so we always try to make this as accessible as possible in terms of the language, the imagery, the graphics that we use. When we worked in Grand Haven and Grand Haven Township, we actually had a whole vulnerability chapter that the township put in their appendix because they didn't want it into their master plan because it was so comprehensive and technical. So you can do it in different ways, but it's important to include that in your master plan. Have a section devoted to some of these topics and talk about that. I talked about the framework being an important component of thinking about a resilient planning process that addresses some of these issues, especially the coastal processes. There's different ones that are out there, so you might find one that's better suited to your community. The International Federation of the Red Cross has a good one that I know a community in Michigan used. NOAA, there's a lot of different frameworks that talk about kind of that triple bottom line approach of how do you do resilient in your community. Finding the right one that's for your community is the great first step to do that. And so when we have that in the framework, then we actually have that in the framework that's an introduction to our plan. So this is, again, the master plan for Grand Haven. The things that are kind of their most important pieces to their master plan and them moving forward are outlined in this process, and they want to understand coastal processes, which you can see here outlined in our second goal, and then building on community resilience and being prepared for climate vulnerability. Those are stated framework issues within that master plan. So going forward, those will always be elements that they can cross their goals and objectives against when they're moving forward. Again, we did talk about having a nice chapter within the master plan that outlines all the things that we've talked about this morning. Again, you can get really technical or you can get really basic, but have something in your master plan that talks about this dynamic processes. One of the things that we talked about earlier is so difficult is that you have a lot of turnover between planning commissioners. So having something in your document that should be the source of what you go to when you're talking about planning and zoning decisions is very important. So having that in the master plan and then stating within the master plan that this will always be a chapter within the plan is important. And then given the dynamics of the lake, updating it every 5 years when you do your 5-year update. Where do lake levels stand now? Where were lake levels 5 years ago is an important part of that master plan process. So included in there, we have some sample language that we could provide that talk about water levels, wave energy, erosion, the connections to climate change. All the things we talked about today are great pieces to include in your master plan, especially with a lot of the imagery that you've seen today. And then we have a whole section on the actual vulnerability of the community where we go back to some of the climate data that is so important as the framework of this discussion. As we mentioned before, a lot of people have a short-term memory, so they don't remember what happens in regards to the shoreline, but also even the kind of the climate events. So every one of our master plans, we have this timeline about the significant weather or climate impacts of their community over the last 20 to 50 years. So again, it reiterates the fact that this is an ever-evolving process in your community and you need to be thinking about it long-term. So having that in the master plan, I think, is a great way to do that. I'm not going to read each one of these goals, but they really go back to not only being more resilient as a decision-making entity from the city, but thinking about all the different green infrastructure pieces that we've talked about today, how to preserve our shoreline. But education is a big component of this. And that was part of the grant that we worked with MAP in Grand Haven, was an actual guidebook for homeowners on what does it mean to be a resilient homeowner within these coastal communities or these coastal settings. And so education is just as part of this planning process as everything else. And I'm not going to read each one of these, but we actually essentially had a section of goals and objectives that specifically dealt with resiliency. A lot of them were talking about setbacks, but a lot of them were talking about, again, how to work with the community and the people in your community and the social services in your community to be more prepared for that change in climate and to be more resilient. I'll go through that. These are just a list of some of the recommendations that came out of the Grand Haven Township planning process that, again, touched upon some of those setback pieces and some of the other pieces that have to do with more of the social services. I will say the biggest thing that we've always done as part of this process is engage the community. It's a huge part of that. We do workshops just like this where Dick and Guy and I present on the work that we've done along with CZM. And we bring in other experts. So other communities might have different issues. We've had folks talking about dunes and bluff lines and how that works. The state climatologist has been going around the state and doing a lot of presentations on the climate data. GLESA, as part of their role, is to educate the community and the state about the changes of climate within the state of Michigan and the Great Lakes Basin. So they will come to your community and be part of one of your civic engagement opportunities. So I encourage you to reach out to those experts, have them present some of these topics, not only at large public settings like you see here, but at small discussions around the table. One of the things that we found is when we talk to the Public Works Director, the Parks and Recreation Director, the City Manager, they have a more intimate knowledge of how climate is impacting their community on a day-to-day basis than most anybody in the community. So having discussions with those key staff members about what are the changes they're seeing, what are the impacts of what they're seeing is part of this process. So really having a thorough civic engagement process is in itself a resilient activity as part of the overall planning process. I think I might go through this very quickly. I'm just curious, how many folks have had issues talking about climate change within the context of their community? With some of just the denial is essentially what we're dealing with?
Well, it's not in Michigan, so I'll just say in Ruston, Louisiana, during the master plan process, we had some people coming out talking about one world government and Agenda 21 and all this stuff, very paranoid conspiracy theory type stuff. And they were very loud throughout the process.
How about anybody else? Anybody push back on this topic from anybody? All right. I think that's a good sign, actually. I think we've kind of moved on from the debate about whether it's happening or not happening. But one of the things that we've learned throughout this process, and I think when we first started, we did get some pushback from some of the communities, is really thinking about why it's happening, or excuse me, not why it's happening, but what is happening. So getting away from the causes and just looking at the data trends itself. What is the data showing it? And that's why it's so great to have the state climatologists on board with you as you're doing some of these presentations, is they really just present the data in a very scientific way and just get right to the root of what's happening. Focusing on local solutions instead of global solutions is a way to do that. And then working again with your community stakeholders. The folks who are on the front lines of doing things in your community have a really good understanding of what the impacts are in your community. We'd like to also say focus on identifying actions of no regret. So even if climate change doesn't happen or it's not a real thing, it's still a good, positive, professional planning activity or tool to do in your community. So it's just an action of regret that we want to have as part of our adaptive actions. Acknowledging the uncertainty of climate science and also the lake variabilities is important. You heard Dick and Guy mention this before. We really don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we can see from trends there's going to be a great deal of variability. We should expect that, but we really don't know what's going to happen next year, 5 years, 10 years down the road. And it's okay to acknowledge that as part of your discussion with your community. Keep within the science and understand there might be trade-offs, as Dick mentioned. The waterfront setbacks versus the fiscal benefit is something that a community has to weigh. So there's politics built into the discussion when we talk about some of these issues that are large scale. As much as you can use these visuals, all the better. So working with your staff to figure out how do we actually illustrate the story of climate change or illustrate the story of our changing lake levels is important. And this can be included in your presentation materials, but also included in portions of those master plan chapters. But I can't tell you how much this kind of imagery speaks for itself. We could probably just show this image for 5 minutes and have a pretty robust discussion on what we're seeing happening here. This is Dick's famous Fire Behind Fury post, but we've gotten some, this was one of the first communities. We had someone in the Ludington community who was blogging essentially about your 21 and putting flames behind a discussion about this. So you're going to get some of this pushback, but think more about, again, education in the communities, understanding that there's going to be an emotional tie to this, especially when we're talking about some of this lake level dynamics and the house that's been in the family generation for years and years and years. What does that mean for them in terms of protecting that entire memory or entire kind of family heritage as part of this larger process? So things to think about, again, when we're talking about climate change, there's different ways to approach it. Given all that, I would say that it's been a lot easier to have this discussion now than it has been in the past, and it sounds like that maybe that's the case for you. I'm going to go through that. Other places where you can incorporate some of these ideas of resilience in site plan review, having kind of best practices, thinking about green infrastructure as kind of built-in components to site plan review. Those of you familiar with LED and the building standards, that is kind of resilient unto itself. There's a way you can incorporate those into your zoning ordinance. Parks and recreation plans have really become kind of on the cutting edge of flood mitigation in a lot of communities. There's different ways that you can incorporate these ideas within plans that are not just your master plan. The same thing with capital improvements when you're looking at infrastructure moving forward, how that's actually funded, how that's maintained. A watershed plan that does that as well, and then you can actually even do something very specific like a climate action plan. Several communities have done that in the state of Michigan. So again, there's different degrees at which you can address some of these issues. Some of them are very comprehensive, some of them are very narrow, depending on what scope you want to work on. Maybe that's the type of plan that you want to look at. Hazard mitigation has always been kind of a go-to for a lot of this information, and that's also a good way to incorporate that, especially for the larger kind of regional perspective at the county level. So that's kind of the planning piece, and I'm going to turn it over to Dick to talk a little bit about the zoning components, especially the discussion that we've had in about the last 2 months or so.
And while you're doing this transition, I would just mention one of the examples that we had from our grant communities was Seaboang. And so they actually had their own utility. The village has a utility. And because they're concerned about maintaining power for the sugar beet processing industry, they found that a lot of their power facilities were located in floodplains. And so they went through this process, they went through this resiliency planning and came up and started to develop policies about developing their infrastructure for that utility within, moving facilities out of the floodplain, not locating things in the floodplain. So, that's an example. It isn't a municipal plan or a master plan, but it still is an opportunity for the community to come together and take these learnings and address the infrastructure.
Okay, so to resituate a little bit, so planning, going back to all of the mapping that I showed you to identify these high hazard areas and map them and think about these settings, that's focusing on the hazard mitigation piece. So you all know this, master plans are not legally enforceable documents, but they provide a lot of the background and justification for the legally significant policy decisions communities make, like where they're going to site infrastructure, where they're going to site public facilities, where they're going to support public infrastructure like roadways and water and such, all have legal implications. And then especially where they're going to adopt zoning and subdivision regulation controls and other regulatory controls that actually tell private property owners what you can and can't do with your land. I think I'm feeling pretty confident that the level of detail and analysis we showed you for mapping these high hazard zones are sufficient for master planning purposes where you're trying to get a community to recognize we have areas that could be at risk and we should adopt policies where the policies are look into adopting setbacks within these zones or require that community members use best low impact development, green infrastructure. But maybe you also, if you're in a bluff area, the last thing you want to do is use low impact development that funnels water into the bluff system that's going to freeze and thaw and cause the superficial failure or accelerate the failure of the bluff. So it's also telling you these are the areas we need to really pay close attention to for those kinds of policy additions. Does that make sense? So back to the point I made earlier, you don't need to know precisely where the 1, 2, 3% storm is going to hit for the level of detail that you need to identify those potential high-risk zones and say these are the areas of concern. You do need to be a little bit more careful, I think, when you're getting into zoning where you're actually now drawing lines on maps, both because politically everybody might be with you until you draw the line on the map and they see that they're inside the line and their neighbor's outside of the line, and how dare you? And also now you're going to have to be justifying what you're doing to a court. So I want to talk a little bit about zoning. So we've done, most of our work to date has been on the master planning piece. How can we help communities develop methods and apply them with basic data analysis to come up with good policies? I have to tell you a story. When we went and gave our final presentation to the Planning Commission for Grand Haven City, we showed up and it was just jam-packed full of people, and I'm thinking, whoa, this is great. We've got this community so interested in planning for high hazard areas. It turns out they had put as an emergency item on their agenda short-term rentals. and they had us before them. So all those poor people there who were there because they were really agitated about the city adopting a short-term rental ordinance had to listen through our zoning ordinance. And it turned out there was a property owner sitting next to me. He didn't know who I was, but my research associate was presenting stuff. And he's sitting there, that's not right, that's not right, that's not right. I do permits for the state. That's not right, that's not right. And I later asked the planning director, who was that guy? Oh, he's a builder, and he applies to the state for permits. And he was really unhappy because we were mapping areas that he was hoping to promote for development in high hazard areas. She's like, don't worry about him, he does that. The cool thing was, after we worked, so we did spend a lot of time working with the Grand Havens, and we stepped through this process. And by the way, we never went in and told the planning commissions, you need to do this because this is where we're headed. We really did everything we could to say, here's the analysis of the possibilities, you need to work through this and own it and decide what you want to do. And by the time we got to that point, then we did a little bit more work, my team did a little bit more work on how do we start thinking about zoning setbacks that they might adopt. And then Harry and Leah came back in and they actually worked with the city to develop and adopt a zoning code setback for part of their shoreline. And by the time that happened, nobody showed up and complained, even the guy who was sitting next to me at the Planning Commission meeting complaining. Because there was enough now political will built up because everybody could see this makes sense to do. So again, another reason to do the planning is because you're laying the groundwork to do the zoning. So we've done initially, so I've been looking now for zoning codes to try and find the model ordinance that we can put out there for communities to use. And what I've realized pretty quickly is there is no model ordinance, and there probably can never be a model ordinance because while plans are pretty consistent across communities, they're really different in terms of how communities organize their zoning ordinances and structure them and how they approach them and apply them. And so I think we're heading more to the road of here's a set of processes you might go through as a planning consultant to help a community draft a zoning code or draft amendments to the zoning code and then work them through the process. And here's some concepts you need to be thinking about. Make sure that when you do that, you bring your attorney along with you, right? Because planners are not lawyers. Ultimately, the municipal attorney is going to have to sign off on what you're doing. Educate them as you're going through the process so they know where you're headed. I can tell you, most municipal attorneys don't get this any more than anybody else does, right? You have to educate them just as much as you have to educate your planning commission members on why this stuff is important and how it works. So make sure you bring along your municipal attorneys. Generally, the purpose is you would amend a zoning code to start dealing with this stuff. The first is hazard mitigation. So you're taking steps to protect the beach, you're taking steps to protect the shoreland and or structures. You need to figure out what you're going to do through the zoning code to get at that. And that's both private beach and public trust beach, all of those things get wrapped up in that. I think there's some really important issues we should be dealing with through zoning in terms of post-storm recovery and response. Who's going to clean up the mess when the storm hits and half the house is hanging off a cliff? Who's going to pay for that? Are we going to leave it to the property owner, or is the state going to come in and declare a disaster and pay for that? A lot of the provisions you need to be thinking about in these high hazard zones are all about protecting the habitat, the wetlands, the natural vegetation, the tree canopy, the grasslands. The wetlands are the nurseries for our Great Lakes fisheries. They're worth protecting. And then pollution control, aesthetics. What we're seeing, a lot of communities are worried about who has sight lines down to the water and up, and what's the massing on the shoreline. Those are reasonable things for you to be thinking about in your zoning codes. And then finally, public access to the beach. I was talking to Matt earlier, especially with the lakes coming back up. There are a lot of places where you can't get down to the beach, and if you can get down to it, you can't walk very far along it because the beach is gone. Do we want to get to the point where there's no access anymore to our public trust Great Lakes beaches, and how might we think about that through the zoning code? Oops. So here are the options that we've started to work on, and this is still preliminary, I'll tell you, and this will be a place again where we update the Resilient Great Lakes Coast website as we start developing this more fully, but just to lay this out. Your first option is do nothing, which basically means you're going to armor the shoreline. Because right now the state, the preference or the default of the state is to issue a permit to armor if you can demonstrate the conditions to do that. And so if you do nothing, unless you have a shoreline property owner who gets that it's not wise, it's a long-term cost to them to armor, you're probably going to see your shoreline get armored. The second is to maybe use just general provisions in your zoning code. Limit development on steep slopes, limit removal of natural vegetation, those kinds of things. They're not applying specifically within a Great Lakes coastal shoreline area, but they would apply just generically because you've got those provisions within the code broadly. The third is to do what Grand Haven did and St. Joseph, which is to adopt a special overlay district or a Great Lakes shoreline district, which now you're starting to funnel the requirements specifically to that district within that focused area. These, by the way, are not mutually exclusive. You could be doing everything except to do nothing. That's pretty much exclusive of everything else. The third is to adopt dynamic Great Lakes shoreline setbacks. Here's a key thing to keep in mind. The shorelines on the Great Lakes are moving. There may be the occasional place where a guy kind of pointed out where the shore is actually pretty stable for whatever reason. And you won't see a boundary move over time, but in most of the lakes, the ordinary high water mark, the recession lines, all of those things are slowly moving landward. So if you're going to adopt a setback, you need to recognize you're going to have to periodically update that setback because it's going to move. So don't let the community get away with the thinking that once we've adopted our setback, we're done. You've got to make it clear to everybody involved that this is going to be a continual evolving process, and I'll talk about some of the challenges of that in a minute. And then here's an idea I'm chewing on. I don't know of anybody that's done it, but why don't, I know that there are more and more communities that are adopting bond requirements for cell towers and wind turbines, which is to say, if you permit the building of a cell tower or a wind turbine, you make the property owner put up a bond that will cover the cost of taking it down when it reaches its end of its life. Why don't we start requiring shoreline property owners to post bonds to pay for the mess once the house gets taken by the lake? I don't know of any place that's done it, and I'm not sure. I've had some lawyers tell me, yeah, that could work, and others tell me, no, I'm not sure that could work. I'm putting it out there because that's something I want us to be talking about. Maybe that's a policy option that we start thinking about. There are some challenges involved with doing your zoning code you should be thinking about. Lawyers, there's this general split in the law. One approach to the law is draw really hard fixed boundaries. And then you have a great deal of certainty. Either you're inside the line and you can do it, or you're outside the line and you can't. The problem, so that makes it easy to administer too, right? There's the line, you can do it, you can't do it. That's kind of the core of a basic zoning code approach. You're in a residential district, you can have a house, you're not, you can't. The problem with that approach is it's pretty clunky. And you might have places where you really could develop if you gave it some more thought, but you've precluded it because you've just drawn a fixed boundary. So the other approach is the performance-based approach. We'll have a general zone, and then we'll specify standards. And that gives you more flexibility to do things. The problem is now you've opened the door for discretion, but for both analytical problems and discretionary abuse. There's no way to escape that here. So communities are going to have to make hard decisions about Where does it make sense to draw fixed lines, and where does it make sense to have general districts with performance-based standards? That'll be part of it. The really difficult problem that we're going to deal with, frankly, is where to set the benchmark from a setback. When we've looked at zoning codes, there are quite a few that have setbacks on their shorefront property. Some of them have setbacks just from the property line, which is kind of a standard 25 feet from your boundary. It's about as setting dumb as you can get. Setting tone deaf as you can get. Because remember, the shorelines are moving. So why would you pick a random 25-foot boundary and say, well, that's our boundary, because that's what we have always done. Not too many are doing that. A lot of them are doing it off the ordinary high water mark. That made sense when everybody thought the ordinary high water mark was a fairly stable boundary to draw. In fact, remember that diagram I showed you? It's not stable at all. So what we're finding in these codes is they're setting their setbacks to the ordinary high water mark, but they never define what that is, and they don't lay out a process for figuring out how to cite it on the ground. So I honestly don't know how those places are administering their codes. That's a piece that we need to do some more research to figure out what's going on there. Do you guys know? Do you have any communities that are setting back from the ordinary high water mark? How do they do it there? Wait.
How do they do it? Most of them honestly don't have very well-defined processes. They'll have a map that is however many years old, and their building department is going off that map, and that's pretty much it. I don't know of any that have a more dynamic process than that.
So part of what we're wanting to develop is a better process to cite the right boundary line, to give you guys some guidance so that you can start working with communities to do that. And I hope we'll be able to do that within the coming year. We've started on that process, but I'm not surprised to hear they don't really know how they're doing it. We've also seen some boundaries back from natural features like bluff edges, which in a way tells you right now where a good setback line is, but next year that bluff could fail. Poof. So again, you've got to take account of moving dynamic boundaries. I think for the purposes of a setback from a Great Lakes shoreland, more and more as I study it, I think the ordinary high water mark is not a good boundary, because it's just showing you where the water ordinarily reaches when water levels are high. I think a recession or an erosion control line is a better approach, because what you're trying to get at is what's the background rate of erosion on this shoreline? Where are we going to draw that line and say X feet back from that? You're basically buying time. That's all this is doing, by the way. You cannot adopt a boundary that will forever protect every piece of property when you recognize the shorelines are moving. All you're doing is pushing back in time when someone's going to have to pick up their house and move it. So Matt mentioned the two boundaries for the state regulations. That's the high-risk erosion program boundaries. If you're in a stretch of shoreland that's designated as a high-risk erosion area, you can build a movable structure within the 30-foot setback of the boundary they draw, or a non-movable structure if you're more than 60 feet back. But some of the structures that have been built that they claim are movable don't look very movable to me. So you need to be careful thinking through where do you draw that line, and then what are the implications and what's the timeline. Someone asked earlier, what's the time period? That really is up to you to decide. How far out into the future do we want to say we're going to be fixing this? And then how often are we going to update that setback line knowing it's going to move back? And then that's the next thing. What's the implication of moving that boundary line? It may become a setback that says no structures lakeward of this, but it could be someone builds just on the other side of it. 5 years from now, you move that line back because the erosion line is moved. You've created a non-conforming structure. So I think the really difficult issue we're going to be dealing with over time is the status of non-conforming structures within these dynamic shoreline boundary zones, and how do we treat them? So I think we can treat them much like we do in the zoning law. If you have a non-conforming structure, right, normally the rule is if it's more than 50% damaged, you have to go ahead and take it out. If you're just continuing to do what was always being done before the regulation was adopted, you can keep going. We could, in a high hazard zone, say, if you're in a high hazard zone non-conforming use, if your house is damaged by fire, you can rebuild it. But if it's damaged by lake storm, now you have to take it out. right? So tie it to the condition that made it a non-conforming structure, something like that. Those are things I'm gonna try and develop better guidance on that, and then those are things the community is gonna have to struggle with. You had a question, sir.
The idea of ordinary high water mark is really a key, because I'm in a community that has a natural rivers ordinance, real similar issues. It's a Huron River, and we have a setback from the river, and we have a bluff setback. And we base everything off of the ordinary high water mark, which is just a line on a map. Well, I don't know if that's a great line, but that's what we use. And it would be the same for the lakes. And I wonder, a question, has that ever been litigated, the ordinary high water mark?
No. No. I mean, the closest was the Burleson case, and all they really were deciding was which applies, the elevation-based standard or the natural mark. So in Michigan, it has not been litigated. There was some early litigation about if you own property and your property line, your title says you own to the meander line, what does that mean? Have you heard of the meander line? Sometimes you'll see on titles, there's a line that's drawn that's called the meander line. It was an early surveying line that just surveyors were using just to approximate the property. And the courts have ruled if you own to the meander line, you actually own to the water's edge. So we do know under case law that the shoreline moves. The courts recognize that your property boundary moves. They haven't dealt well with the notion of the ordinary high water mark. The key to it is this key boundary, but there's not been litigation to really clarify what that means. The more and more I think about this, the more I think the ordinary high water mark for regulatory purposes is not a good line to be using. The trick is, what's the better line? I think it's the erosion control line, but then you get into the question of how do you measure that and identify that? So that's maybe where we're headed next. You had a question.
Actually, just kind of a statement. One of the things that I do for a zoning administrator is the first, like you said, the ordinary high water mark. What I do is when I go out to a property, let's say it's somebody that has a blank piece of property and they want to build on the lake. I go out and I take a picture of where the ordinary high water mark is, measure my 100-foot back. Well, I guess DEQ or EGO is great about telling us exactly, you can see where it is, the lines, plus you can actually see from GIS, or when you walk out there, you can see where it is, where the plant life is and where it stops and all of that. So we take a picture of it right then and there, like that day. Then what I do is I go off of the setback from the house on the right and the setback from the house on the left. And so they can't build, above or in front of anyone else. So I have those two conditions that I have. And actually it's been working out, I think, really well. Plus, when you start to look, it's almost like an average of where it is in the whole township. Nobody's building way out front or anything like that. Yeah. So that's what I'd use.
So that's what I'm going to want to come talk to you. Because we're turning our attention now to zoning administrators and finding out, I want to get more details on how are you actually, given the way your zoning code is structured, how are you implementing this? So I definitely want to chat with you more. So I may be overstate. No, I don't think I am. I think the ordinary high water mark can be really problematic. It's especially troublesome when it really kind of hinges, particularly if DEQ hasn't drawn lines that you can draw off of, where do you site it on any given day, given where lake levels are and where the beach is. So it can really move pretty dramatically. Well, that's not a stable boundary line to be working with. So there's some room there, I think, for us to improve where these setback lines should be drawn. And then what's the distance beyond that? It seems to me more to find the erosion line and then find the erosion rate and then do it on a fixed period of time and say, do the 30-year setback or the 60-year setback or something like that. Logically, to me, that makes more sense. And because now you're fixing, what we're telling the property owners, you've got a term of time where you should expect to be able to use your property, but you should also expect at some point you're probably going to have to pick up your home and move it. If it's 100 feet, why 100 feet? And how long is that good for? And it kind of takes out the time component of what's going on here. So ordinary high water mark might work okay in a riverine system where periodically the river comes up and down, but it's not dramatically eroding away. On a Great Lakes shoreline, I don't think it makes sense if there's a substantial background shoreline erosion rate.
Inland waterways, the ordinary high water mark is defined it's different agencies based on whether the water is moving or not or something.
Different bodies of law.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's counties handle moving waterways or something like that, and stationary waterways are done by the state or something like that. I'm trying to remember exactly how it's done.
I don't know the answer to that for sure.
Yeah, but at any rate, there's different places you got to look for your inland waterways than for your
yeah. So
Great
again,
Lakes
I'm really talking about
shores.
Great Lakes waterfront. There is some question about where does, in these drowned-mouth rivers, where does the Great Lakes water law and the inland law begin? And I'm not sure that I know the answer to that even. I'm not sure that that's been resolved. So, yeah. I know that we're getting, so another issue is going to be how do you treat non-conforming uses? And then this post-storm recovery response bond I want to look into. And then I think it's really vital in the zoning code itself that you make it clear this is a setback that is going to be reviewed periodically. It's not set in stone for all time because this is a dynamic system and it's going to move, or it could move, and that we'll be revisiting that. So this is just, remember the St. Joseph zoning code where they adopted a setback based on their engineering studies? That's what they did. In their zoning code, they mapped the line. And it's described textually and by coordinates and drew that line, and that's their setback now. And I think they expect that they will periodically revisit it. What we did in Grand Haven, when we started the process of, well, where might they draw a setback for their code, we started down the road of, well, you could map your perfect storm area, you could have mapped the 25-year erosion line, the 60-year erosion line, and they all start to converge. And then Harry, do you want to keep going with this, or? So Harry Leah's shop started to work with them more directly, and here's some imagery of that shoreline over time, just to get a sense of how it's changed over time. Again, that's after a long period of low water, lots of inflated beach. The city had a shoreline that allowed you to move your structure lakeward if it didn't exceed your neighboring property. So the planning director was getting worried that people were going to start moving homes toward the lake because they had that feature in the setback, and she didn't want to do that. So we started to drop, well, here are all these different ways of thinking through the lines you might adopt for a setback. Harry pulled up, they went and did some title searches. There's this really weird bump out there. Who knows why they platted it that way back when. But if you're drawing lines back from property boundaries, that's why there's that funny bump out in terms of the property boundaries setback. Then they went ahead and using elevation contours, they showed the 50-year flood elevation line from the state of Michigan, which kind of lined up there. And then they looked at the 60-year recession line, again, drawn from state of Michigan data. And part of this shoreline is state-designated high-risk erosion area. So, can't really see it. They ended up basically combining those lines and dropped it a district line. So that's their setback line that's smoothed out. And it's described in the ordinance textually by coordinates.
It's the combination of those two.
It's the combination of the rescission line. And they state clearly in the zoning code that this will be updated periodically to adjust for the dynamic shoreline. And effectively, once you have a structure that is lakeward of that line, it becomes a non-conforming use, and then it's treated like other non-conforming uses in the zoning code. So that's where we're headed in terms of zoning. I think the final thing I'll say about zoning is, have you heard of the Lucas decision, the regulatory takings case, the famous South Carolina regulatory takings case? So that's where Justice Scalia ruled that if you take all of the economic value of a piece of property, it's a regulatory taking, you have to buy it basically. But he recognized there may be conditions under which that doesn't really hold, and I call it the Lucas loophole. And what he said was, if under traditional property and land use law in your state, you never had the right to do what the statute is telling you can't do, then you never had that right as part of your bundle of property rights. Therefore, the regulation telling you can't do it isn't taking away from you. You didn't have it in the first place. Does that make sense? It's not a regulatory taking. If ever, now I'm coming full circle back to the public trust doctrine, if ever there were a background state property law in this state that should stand up against a regulatory takings claim, it's the public trust doctrine, which has been recognized as part of our state body of law since the foundation of the state. So I think if a community is really careful about adopting setbacks on Lake Michigan that's tied to the notion of protecting public trust resources, through the authorities they have to act, I will never tell you that you're completely safe against a regulatory takings claim, but it's a pretty good, you've got a pretty good argument that there's a reason for this regulation and it's a reasonable thing for you to be doing. The trick is to give people the opportunity to pick up and move or do something with their property and not just completely turn it into a butterfly farm, which can be tricky in some places, but that's the direction to be headed.
The only thing that I would add to the zoning ordinance was they actually stated, I'll just use this, the intent was to preserve that public trust. I mean, that language is in the zoning ordinance, and the value of that beach as a community as part of the identity of the city of Grand Haven. So that language is in the intent of the ordinance, which I think sets a precedent for the actual the language for the rest of the ordinance itself. We're running up against the clock, and we do have a hands-on exercise we'd love you to stick around for. I just want to show you guys that in 2017, again with assistance through the Coastal Zone Management Program, Leah and along with our partners developed this Planning for Community Resilience in Michigan comprehensive handbook. And it has all the things that we've talked about today, essentially. What is community resilience? What are the impacts in terms of climate change within the state of Michigan from a coastal perspective, but also from a community-wide perspective, how to do civic engagement around these topics, how to gather the data that we've talked about and how to use that data, and then how do you implement that into your plan and some of your zoning practices. So I would point this out to you as a resource that you can download from our website on different ways that you can do that. I'm going to go through this real quickly. This is the website right here, resilientmichigan.org. You can download that as well. At the top of that, you'll see a little tab that says communities. Those are all the communities we work with. If you want to see some of the master plans that we developed as part of this process, you can link onto that website as well and hear more about that. We also developed a video series, a 8-part Resilient Michigan video series on these specific topics with different experts around the state that just give a little bit more perspective on what does it mean to be a resilient community, especially from a coastal perspective. And these are really short videos, about 5 minutes long. So if you're looking to play something for your planning commission or your city council or township board as part of this overall discussion, you can kind of pick and choose each one of these videos that have the specific topics. But another resource that's also on that website that kind of talks about what does it mean to be a resilient community, especially in Michigan.